Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'll be looking at Philosophy Before Socrates by Richard McKirahan. And this book was originally published in 1994, and then a second edition was published, the second edition from 2010. And not a tremendous amount of difference between the first and second edition, but there is some important stuff in the second edition that relates to the presocratic philosopher Empedocles. And that's who I want to talk about, so it's important to note, and we'll get into why, as I look closer, we'll get into why the 2010 version is different than the 94 version. I don't want to talk about any of the other presocratics. This talks about all, really, of the presocratic philosophers with a chapter on each. I've already talked about several of them, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides. I want to talk about Empedocles, and then I think that's probably going to be the extent of my examination of the presocratics, most likely. There is some other stuff in here I want to talk about as well. The book does talk about the poet Pindar, and of course, the poet Homer talks about those guys. I want to talk about that a little bit. And it talks a little bit about the sophists, and so I will get into that a little bit as well. This book does a pretty good job. It gives a pretty fair treatment of these guys. It does fall into the pattern that I spoke of in previous episodes that is often the case where the religious or mythological aspects of the presocratic philosophers is sort of downplayed, although I don't think this author does that to the extent that some others do. I think that's becoming less prominent, and some of the presocratics are more inclined toward mythological thinking, perhaps, than others, or references to the gods than others are. And, of course, all of the presocratics do really have a sense in which they're exploring and examining the natural world and trying to explain phenomenon. And so, without always having explicit reference to the gods. Now, there is reference to the gods, and that is a component in here. But it is true that they step back from that a little bit and look more for natural explanations of things. But they don't completely drive out the mythological perspective. I think that a lot of later thinkers, particularly during the Christian era, looked back at these presocratic philosophers and really tried to sort of downplay the amount of paganism that was in their writings in order to perhaps justify their examination and their concentration on these thinkers. But that's starting to change, and I think you see some of that changing in this book. So like all of my episodes, I'm going to read some sections about the particular thinkers that I want to talk about. I'll read a few sections and then provide a little bit of feedback about it. I've got a fair number of sections I want to read in here, so we'll see about how long this episode comes to. As you probably know, the episodes vary widely, but I've got a lot of sections here I want to look at in this book. So without any further ado, I want to jump in and start reading a little bit here about Empedocles. In this section, he says, quote, "The philosophical oeuvre of Empedocles is composed in the epic meter also used by Xenophanes and Parmenides. The genuinely poetic quality of his writing, which has been admired since antiquity, constitutes an obstacle to understanding his literal message, though its figurative and emotional content give it a vividness and urgency unmatched in philosophical writings before Plato. His style suits his purpose, which is not primarily to give an account of the cosmos, though it involves this too, but to exhort us to achieve salvation and to show us how. His surviving fragments constitute the largest bulk of material surviving from any presocratic, but they admit of widely differing interpretations, and readers from the time of Aristotle, who presumably had access to all his writings, have found themselves perplexed. Because of the difficulties, and because of the large amount of material, my discussion of Empedocles will be more selective, less comprehensive, and also more dogmatic than in previous chapters. Empedocles is said to have composed tragedies, a historical poem on the Persian War, a poem to Apollo, and medical writings, as well as philosophical poetry, which will be our exclusive concern, and for which two titles are recorded, On Nature and Purifications. The traditional view holds that these were two separate poems on different, incompatible themes. On Nature was a scientific poem, which treated the elements, love and strife, the nature of compounds, the origin and present structure of the cosmos, the origin of animal species, and topics in physiology, perception, cognition, and epistemology, while Purifications was concerned with the fall of spirits from a godlike state into mortal creatures, their transmigration, and their hope of ultimate redemption and regaining divine status through the abstention from certain practices and the following of certain rituals. For want of a better word, I will refer to these topics as religious. On this account, the poems not only treat different subjects, but also are mutually contradictory, for the scientific poem maintains that the only everlasting things are the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, and the two entities that cause them to move, love and strife. All other things are perishable compounds, whereas the religious poem requires the spirits to be immortal. Moreover, the development of the cosmos in the scientific poem, in which the spirits must take part, is thought incompatible with the everlasting divine bliss, which is the lot of the redeemed spirits. This interpretation can be questioned. In the first place, a clear distinction between the scientific and the religious was alien to pre-Socratic thought. Heraclitus and Parmenides provide the most striking cases of this fact, or indeed to Greek philosophy in general, although the philosophers' notions of the divine were in the main remote from the Olympian gods. The Pythagoreans believed in the soul's immortality and reincarnation. Thus there is no a priori reason why the nature, history, and prospects of the human soul should not form part of a work on the nature, history, and prospects of the cosmos, and of the elements and compounds within it. Further, if there really is inconsistency, it may not make much difference for our overall interpretation of Empedocles, whether the incompatible features occur in different poems or in different parts of the same poem. Either way, we must qualify or restrict our conclusions accordingly. And finally, there may be no inconsistency at all if we are prepared to accept an appropriate conception of immortality, one bound up with the fate of the elements and devoid of personal identity. Beginning in the 1980s, the traditional view was challenged by a minority of scholars, and its central claim that the physical material could not belong to the same poem as the religious material was decisively refuted by the publication in 1999 of Empedoclean material that had been lost since antiquity. The text in question, known as the Strasbourg Papyrus, was purchased in Egypt, its country of origin, in 1904, and brought to the papyrus collection at the Imperial Library of Strasbourg, where it remained unstudied until the 1990s. Its importance was immediately recognized, and it was soon afterwards published in an excellent edition. It contains 74 lines of Empedocles' poetry, many of them only partly preserved. Because of the state of preservation of the papyrus, the lines are not continuous, but 4 sections are long enough to make some difference to our understanding of Empedocles' thought, and in addition they coincide with, overlap with, or include already known fragments. With the addition of new material, fragment 14.58 is extended from 36 to 69 continuous lines, although some lines are incomplete, thus becoming the longest surviving fragment of any pre-Socratic. The most striking feature of the new material, and one that is relevant to the question at hand, is that the section of the papyrus that makes up the last part of fragment 14.58 contains religious material, whereas the first part of the fragment is one of the most central sections of Empedocles' scientific doctrines. This proves that Empedocles had no difficulty putting both kinds of material in the same poem, in fact, in the same context, only a few lines apart. This discovery does not settle the question whether there were two poems, one poem referred to by two titles, or one poem known as a whole as On Nature, a part of which was known as Purifications. And if there were two poems, to which poem each of the surviving fragments belongs. But there is far less at stake in the questions that remain. The challenge now is to reach a satisfactory interpretation of the material we have, ideally one that combines the two aspects of his doctrine. In what follows, I will present a sketch of Empedocles' scientific ideas, and then offer an interpretation of his religious views which, so far from being inconsistent with the former material, coheres with it to form a whole. End quote. So there you have the basic story of Empedocles' two poems, or what was largely considered two poems, a scientific poem and a religious poem. But as he says, in the Greek world, there wasn't this sort of strong distinction between the scientific and the religious. That's a more modern state of mind. In the ancient world, there wasn't a tradition of non-religious scientific study like we have now, and the religious aspects were just generally widely acknowledged to be truth. And so it wasn't like now where there's people who believe, people who don't believe, and if you believe nowadays, if you believe in religious doctrines, generally Christian religious doctrines, it relies upon some form of faith, right? You have to believe it, not because you can see it or because you can record it or because you could, but because you simply trust. I mean, that's what faith is. You don't have evidence. If you had evidence, it wouldn't be faith. And so we have this separation between those things for which we have evidence, and we call that science, and then those other things for which we simply have faith. That wasn't the way that these that questions about reality and questions about the gods and so forth, that wasn't the way this material was kind of understood back then. So it's really a modern imposition. So with the discovery of this new papyrus that combines elements that we would understand to be part of his scientific poem and other stuff that we would classify as part of what would be part of a religious poem, it's all part of the same papyrus. It's all part of the same document. And so we can't really make that distinction anymore. And I think that kind of points out, to me, it sort of points out the way that these pre-Socratic philosophers have been, to some extent, simply misunderstood. I want to jump to the next section. He talks in a little bit more detail about what exactly Empedocles is saying. You saw there. He mentioned. He said that On Nature was a scientific poem which treated the elements, love and strife, the nature of compounds, the origin and present structure of the cosmos. He's talking about the four elements, earth, air, water, and fire, and he talks about love and strife. And love and strife are, for Empedocles, these forces that work in the world. And what's interesting is that we don't really think of love and strife as forces, impersonal forces. We think, especially love, we think of it as something that exists between people, or even like between living entities. But he understands love and strife as well as the elements in a way that's, centuries, thousands of years really removed from the way that we look at those sorts of things today. You have to understand this is sort of an alien mindset from our own. It can be hard for us to understand, and oftentimes we have to sort of set aside the way that we automatically interpret things and approach the pre-Socratics with sort of a clear mind and see, how do they understand it? How does Empedocles understand these things? And how do the Greeks understand these things so that we can put Empedocles' words into the context of the ancient understanding and not just interpreted through our own modern understanding? So here, what he says is, quote, "At the elemental level, there are four basic substances. These are eternal and fixed in quantity. They do not change into one another, or come to be, or suffer destruction, or undergo change in their basic qualities. They maintain their identity intact. Each exists fully, and aside from them, and love and strife, there is nothing." Empedocles calls them not elements, but roots, an evocative term which suggests that they are living sources from which other things grow, to which he gives the names of gods in fragment 14.46. The Sicilian goddess Nestis, used as another name for Persephone, goddess of the underworld, represents water. Zeus is fire, and Hera and Aidoneus, another name for Hades, probably represent air and earth, respectively. Empedocles uses a range of terms for his elements. Fire is also flame, sun or Helios, the shining one or Elector, and Hephaestus. Water is also called rain, and two names, Pontos and Thalassa, which both translate as sea. Air is heaven or Oranos, and aether. Earth is referred to in several ways, Chthon, Gaia, Aya, which all translate as earth. The variation in names raises an important question. Did Empedocles conceive of his elements as pure substances? Since he knew that rain is fresh water and sea is salt water, he should recognize that sea water is impure in comparison with rainwater. This way of thinking leads to the concept of perfectly pure water, air, etc., idealized forms of these materials, which perhaps never occur in isolation in the cosmos around us, but out of which substances we encounter, such as rainwater and seawater, are composed. But the use of sea and rain indifferently as names for the same element may point to the opposite view, that seawater and rainwater, perhaps other liquids too, are each fully as much water as any of the others, so that the term water covers many liquids, and likewise air, many gases, and earth, many solids. Alternatively, if Empedocles held that the elements are, properly speaking, pure, the variety of names by which he calls them may be a deliberate maneuver to avoid identifying any single familiar substance with a pure element. Section 14.46 then may be more than allegory, since ordinary conceptions of the gods are misguided. The names Zeus, Hera, etc. really refer to the elements. The four roots join to form mortal compounds, which, unlike the immortal elements, come to be and perish. More properly stated, they are formed by mixture and dissolved by separation of their component elements. The reference to the roots as immortal and to compounds as mortal and as undergoing birth and death is not simply metaphorical. One of the most familiar contrasts in ancient Greek culture is between the immortality of the gods and the mortality of humans. On the traditional view, the gods are privileged in a way that humans, who are born and die, are not. But both gods and humans are living beings. Empedocles frequently calls the roots by the names of the Olympian deities, and he describes the roots and their compounds in language suitable for living things. Further, as the fragments show, living things, plants, animals, and humans, and their parts, are his most frequently occurring examples of compounds. This provides another link between the different areas of Empedocles' thought. Mixing the elements to form compounds and dissolving compounds into separate elements are functions of love and strife, respectively. Love attracts dissimilars to dissimilars, while strife, in separating dissimilars, attracts like to like. Love and strife are opposed to one another and exist always. When love fully dominates and strife is inoperative in the cosmos, the totality of the four elements is mixed together into a single uniform sphere. Conversely, when strife dominates and love is unable to do its work, the four elements are separated from one another by being completely segregated into concentric spherical shells, with the earth at the center, surrounded in turn by water, air, and fire. How Empedocles conceived of love and strife is problematic. One issue is whether they are something like forces which operate on matter but are immaterial, as we might expect from statements that compounds are made up of the four elements, not the four elements plus love and strife. But he describes love and strife in terms appropriate to material entities with spatial locations, equal in all directions, among them equal in length and breadth, and spinning among them. Also, love and strife occupy different parts of the cosmos at different stages of its existence. It may be that he conceived of love and strife as immaterial forces, and that the spatial language just cited is used metaphorically. But I find it more plausible to take this language as evidence of the difficulty of conceiving of an immaterial force in the mid-5th century. Aristotle aptly complains that Empedocles makes love and strife principles, both as movers and as matter, for they are parts of the mixture. Love and strife must be physically present among the elements to operate on them, and yet the elements are thought to be the only physical constituents of compounds. Empedocles expresses the relation between love and strife and the elements by saying that the latter mix and are separated by love, by the hatred of strife, in anger and in love, through their birth in strife, etc. Language suggesting that he thought of love and strife as agents, not constituents. And yet they are agents that act by their presence. If they depart, their effects do not remain, whereas compounds continue to exist because of the continuing presence of love, and likewise the elements remain separate from one another because of the continued presence of strife. Another issue is whether love and strife are responsible for all changes that occur in the cosmos. It is tempting to think of the elements as inert matter, and love and strife as what makes them move. But such an interpretation runs the risk of anachronism, since earlier philosophers had supposed motion to be an inherent feature of their primary substance, not requiring an external cause. Moreover, the elements seem to have motions due to their own nature, fire and air upward, and no doubt water and earth downward, and the whirling vortex motion of the cosmos compels the earth to move to the center. On the basis of this evidence, I conclude that love and strife are directly responsible not for all motion, but specifically for the mixing and separation of the elements. For a compound to form, we need both the correct amounts and proportions of its constituent elements and also of love, in the right amounts and proportions to unite them in the right way. How, then, do love and strife affect the elements? They are not simply mechanical forces. Things under the influence of love love one another, while those under strife's power are enemies and very mournful. He calls love by other names: friendship, Aphrodite, joy, Harmonia, and declares that she is responsible for kindly thoughts and peaceful deeds. The cosmic unifying force is identical with the familiar force of love, which unites different humans. Love's operation in the cosmos is psychological as much as physical. Through her, the different elements are attracted to or yearn for one another. Similarly for strife, which is also called quarrels and hatred, and is characterized as destructive, as evil, and as that which operates by hatred, makes the elements bitter and causes them to hate each other. In addition, love and strife are moral agents. Love and her effects are good. Strife and its effects are evil. Empedocles' cosmos is therefore far from simply a physical environment, but has psychological and moral aspects built into it from the very foundations, which further supports the idea that immortal elements and mortal compounds are in some sense living things. This combination of different realms of reality seems odd today, but if we recall the tradition of Heraclitus and the Pythagoreans, it is not out of place in the first half of the 5th century. The equality of love and strife is a striking feature of Empedocles' system, and must be understood at the moral and psychological level, as well as at the mechanical level. The treatment of opposites given by his predecessors made it unthinkable for Empedocles to attempt to account for strife, hatred, and evil in the world if the only relevant principle was a principle of love, harmony, and good. Opposites are equally powerful and cannot be generated one from the other. Also, since at the mechanical level both separation and union are seen to take place, a principle of separation or unification without a corresponding opposite principle would ultimately lead to a dead end, at which all possible separation or unification had occurred. Further, if there were only a single principle, Empedocles would be vulnerable to questions Parmenides had raised, how the cosmic process got started in the first place, and what the original arrangement was like. Questions to which Empedocles' everlasting cosmic cycle, powered by love and strife, makes cosmology immune. End quote. Okay, so there's a lot going on in there. He's talking gives a basic summary of what Empedocles' vision of the cosmos looks like. And Empedocles is describing these 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and these repeating cycles where love and strife are acting in the world. They're acting on the elements. And when love is totally dominant, then the 4 elements are completely mixed together. They're completely combined, unified, brought together into a single thing, a sphere. He describes it as a single sphere of matter that is completely and evenly mixed arrangement of the 4 elements. And when strife reaches its apex, these 4 elements are completely separated, so that you've got concentric circles, concentric spheres, with earth at the center, surrounded by water, surrounded by air, surrounded by fire. And all the time, one or the other is ascendant and one is descendant. And so once it reaches its like total separation under the apex of strife, then love becomes ascendant, and the different things begin to mix together. And so that's this sort of endless process. And what the author here, McKirahan, is talking about is how to understand these things in the sense that, like, okay, well, the 4 elements, he refers to them as roots. He doesn't refer to them as elements. And there's more of like a living quality to these elements. Again, when we think of them as elements, we're accustomed to like the periodic table of elements. We're accustomed to the idea that there's just this certain type of matter that can't be reduced any further than that. It can't be altered. It's this basic element, and it's totally mindless. It's just inert matter. Whereas in the ancient world, it wasn't understood quite like that. He describes them as roots. He doesn't describe them as elements, but they're roots. They're like the fundamental things out of which everything comes into being, out of these 4 roots. And roots, are generally beneath the earth. They're kind of hidden. And in the same way, these elements in their pure form is sort of hidden from us because we live in a world of compounds. We live in a world where everything is in some way mixed. All these things are sort of mixed, and it's either difficult or impossible to locate instances of them in an absolutely pure form. And so things are coming about and passing away because we're in this churning world of compounds of these 4 elements. And then he asks, okay, well, what is love and strife? Are these forces like we would understand, like gravity, as a sort of a force that acts on the world, kinetic energy, things of that nature. We kind of see this invisible, immaterial, intangible force that acts on matter. That's how we see it and understand it. And the question is that really how Empedocles understands it? That love and strife have no material form. They're just this invisible, immaterial force in the world acting upon matter. But he uses some terminology describing love and strife that would indicate that there may be some material component to it. And the other thing that's important and worth pointing out is how he gives the names, and he's not consistent, but he gives names of the deities to the elements. So he describes fire as Zeus. He calls it Zeus, but he also calls it Hephaestus. So those are two different gods. And it's hard to kind of crack into the ancient mind to see why he would describe it as different deities, as though like the root itself is the most pure and almost like inconceivable, that we can't quite grasp it, but we can approach it from one angle and we would see it as Zeus. But if we were to approach it from a different angle, we would see it as Hephaestus. That's how this unreachable root would manifest. And then again, also to remember that there's a one thing that's important to point out here is that Empedocles wrote poetry. All of his philosophy is in the form of poetry. And it's epic poetry. It's the same epic meter that's used by Parmenides. And as I talked about in ancient Greek philosophy, when I talked at length about Parmenides, there's definitely a religious quality to Parmenides' writing in the same way that there is to Empedocles. I mean, Empedocles writes, as I stated in the beginning of the first section I read, Empedocles had written a poem to Apollo. It's not that Empedocles disbelieves in the gods or anything like that. He does, and the immortality of the gods and the immortality of the elements binds them together. There's sort of a divinity, a divine quality to these things, and so there's and the gods are like living agents. They're conscious, or they act in the world in a way. And so when he speaks about fire and water and so on, he speaks about them as if they have their own sort of livingness, their own sentience, or their own kind of divine quality to them that goes above and beyond what we nowadays see as this sort of base inert matter. But again, we don't have all of his writings. There's a large amount that we don't have. Presumably, these are major figures, and I think it's likely that there was more that was written. I mean, if you think about how much Plato wrote and how much Aristotle wrote, we can figure that it's likely that there's more to it than the, really scanty fragments of all of these guys, all of these ancient philosophers that we have now today. So we'll never, unless we're somehow some new discovery even greater than the Strasbourg papyrus, we're never going to have the whole story, the whole collection of anything these guys wrote. It's just lost. And so all we can do is try to piece it together. But I think that there's definitely, like he says that love, he also calls love Aphrodite. Well, that's clearly one of the gods, the goddess Aphrodite. And I think it's important to kind of point out that the ambiguity about all this stuff is perhaps an important aspect of it. Because I think that one thing that's happening here is there is a questioning among these thinkers. They're postulating different theories about what the nature of reality is, what the nature of the cosmos is. And they're not putting forward the same ideas. Some might say, well, water is really like the fundamental element, or air is the fundamental element, or all four of these elements are all fundamental. They're not all in agreement, and these are basic questions about what reality is. So this isn't the sort of area where there's agreement about the basics, and then there's questions about the details, because there's really not agreement about the basics. And they're stepping away from some of the more regularly recognized ideas, and they're trying to piece it together. And so the conception, I think, of what a deity, what a god even is sort of in flux. Is it like an anthropomorphic dude on top of a mountain? Or is it something more like a force in the world that is immaterial, like gravity or something? How, does it lie somewhere, if you think of a spectrum of like fire as we would understand it, as sort of an immaterial process, versus like Zeus, and as a person who wields lightning bolts and lives on top of a mountain? And are the gods sort of somewhere between those 2 points? Are the gods like Platonic ideals? And as I get in talking about Plato, we'll examine this some more when we talk about Plato's ideals, ideal forms, that's sort of almost is an echo of the gods. The gods, the ideals, the roots, the elements, are these the same thing? So with all the questions that are coming about of what really are the gods and what is the nature of reality, a lot of ideas going back and forth, and a lot of kind of discussion and attempts to pin this down, and nothing is really particularly, dogmatic answers to these questions at this time. So it's an era when people are really just trying to figure out what the nature of reality is, what the nature of the gods are, and it seems like there's sort of a crossover. It's a little bit divine, maybe it's a little bit material, maybe it's a little bit psychological. To what extent matter has moral qualities, psychological qualities. All these different ways of understanding reality get kind of mishmashed a little bit, and these guys are trying to fine-tune it and come up with answers about what reality is like. So I think it's really interesting to understand that these are guys. They're not just simply flat out stating this is what this is, that's what that is. I mean they are, but I think it's understood that each one of them is putting forward their own theory, and they're not all in agreement with one another, and they can't all be right. And so I think that there's probably an understanding that each person is just putting forward their own theory. I think even back then it was understood that, well, that's just this guy's theory, and this is this other guy's theory. So I think it was understood that it was a sort of experimental, theoretical proposals that these guys were putting forward. Anyway, let me keep moving to the next section. This is the last part that I want to read about Empedocles, where he says, quote, "The cosmic cycle efficiently accounts for the workings of the cosmos. It requires only the 4 elements and 2 motive principles already discussed, and it does not postulate any properties of love and strife aside from their functions of uniting and separating. It makes clever use of both the Anaximandrian concept of dynamic equilibrium of opposed principles and of the Heraclitean concept of stability through change. The fact that the elements are immortal and have always behaved in this cyclical pattern makes it unnecessary to account for how they came to be or started to behave that way in the first place, so that Empedocles does not fall foul of Parmenides' use of the principle of sufficient reason. The general outline of the cosmic cycle is clear, but several of its details require discussion. Although his system is founded on a cyclical alternation of love and strife, Empedocles says little to explain why the alternation takes place. Fragment 14.81 suggests that there is a set time for strife, and also, no doubt, for love to prevail, so that the cycle is regular, but it offers no physical explanation, only a reference to a broad oath, an image reminiscent of Anaximander's ordering of time, and Heraclitus's ever-living fire kindled in measures and extinguished in measures, and perhaps of Parmenides' limits of great bonds. Aristotle's sour comment on this fragment, that he says nothing about the cause of the change, except that it is naturally that way, is perhaps unfair, since if the alternation of love and strife is a basic fact of the system, it is also a brute fact, incapable of explanation within the system. From the systematic point of view, Aristotle has a point. Empedocles just asserts that this is how it is. But the reference to an oath, an unbreakable sacred principle voluntarily agreed to by the two great equal powers, removes the claim from the level of mere assertion and grounds the system in a transcendental religious conception, which can provide the needed guarantee of everlasting stability. The dual births and perishings of the cosmos imply that both generation and perishing are attributable to love and also to strife, despite Empedocles' tendency to speak of love as causing generation and strife as causing destruction. Since cosmoi and compounds can no more exist in the sphere of love than they can exist in the complete separation under total strife, for love to achieve domination involves the perishing of all compounds, as well as of the cosmos that arose in the transition from strife to love, and equally the formation of the cosmos and compounds in the opposite transition phase is due to strife's breaking up of the sphere of love. Although the surviving fragments do not say so, the present cosmos is located in the period of increasing strife. The elements are now mostly separated, with the vast bulk of each already separate from the others, so strife must be far along in its advance toward total rule. This situation may account for the prevalence of hostility and war among humans. Since we live in a period of increasing strife, the present is worse than the past, and the future will be worse yet, a view supported by traditional stories about a decline from a golden age." End quote. So in that section, he just kind of reiterates that there's a sort of perpetual cosmic cycle, but there's a few important points that he makes. The first one is that he doesn't really say why this whole process is taking place, but he refers to an oath, a broad oath, and he mentions how this reference to an oath is reminiscent of Anaximander's ordering of time, Heraclitus's ever-living fire kindled in measures and extinguished in measures, and perhaps of Parmenides' limits of great bonds. To me, that reminds me, and maybe this is just my own inclination, but it reminds me of Ananke, necessity, that I had talked about in a few previous episodes. Ananke is the goddess of necessity, but is also related to fate and is related to oaths. So they're bound, so that strife and love are bound by necessity to participate in this everlasting cycle. They're restricted in their activities. They can't choose. The point being that love and strife don't choose to do this, but they're forced to do this by some sort of oath, some sort of promise that they've made of some sort to participate in this endless practice of shifting the cosmos from one to the other. So that I thought that's interesting, and maybe that doesn't really tie back to Ananke in any way, but I sort of see it. And the other thing that he says is that both love and strife are responsible for creation and destruction. It's not simply the case that love is responsible for generation and creation, and strife is responsible for destruction. because to achieve the state of pure love, when all things are unified, that requires the destruction of all individual things, all the compounds that all mortals are comprised of. The world, living in the world of separate things, requires the presence of strife. And to live in a world in which strife is completely driven out of the world would be the dominance of love, but that would involve everything joining together and becoming one, and the world of things, it would no longer exist when love reaches its apex and the world is simply one mixed sphere. And so both in love and in strife, in the process of love and strife, that's how all of the things of the world, all of the living creatures of the world, all come to be and pass away through this interaction. And so it's sort of like in order for people to live in the world, we have to be in between these two competing forces. We can't just we could never, to advocate for love to completely rule the world would be to advocate for the annihilation of all things. Which I think is interesting. And another thing that I think that reminds me of, actually, is when I spoke of Apollo and Dionysus, when I reviewed Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and also Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae. Apollo being like the god that represents distinction and separation, lines and isolation and formation of things, and then Dionysus representing the elimination of all the boundaries between things, and kind of sort of a liquefying, smushing together of everything, and lack of separation and lack of distinction and perpetual motion, whereas Apollo would be like not moving but just separating from one thing to another. Stasis, Apollo would be like the god of the statue, like this thing is that, and it's not anything else. And so that sort of isolation and pinning something down like that. And in that sense, strife almost seems reminiscent of Apollo, and love seems reminiscent of Dionysus. Although he doesn't seem to identify love and strife with Dionysus and Apollo respectively, it does seem sort of reminiscent to that in my mind. Of course, along those lines, just like I say that to totally submit to love or strife would be the annihilation of all of the intermediate compounds that constitute our world, the same could be said of Dionysus and Apollo. If Apollo were hypothetically in control of all things, then there would be no change, there would be no growth, there would only be separation, distinction, definition, and a sort of calcification of all things. Dionysus allows the churn that allows for things to grow and for things to move and for things to change. But a total domination of Dionysus, likewise, would just sort of wind up with an undefinable mud. And so in the same way, we sort of have to live in a world between the balance of these two forces. So anyhow, I think I'm going to leave my discussion of Empedocles right there and just talk probably somewhat briefly about these other figures and these other movements. And when he's talking, this is chapter 19, when he talks about early Greek moral thought and the 5th century sophists. In this section, he says, quote, "Many of the presocratics expressed opinions on questions in moral, political, and social philosophy. Moreover, serious treatment of such questions goes much further back, to the beginnings of Greek literature, in the poems of Homer and Hesiod, which date to the 8th century, some 300 years before Socrates. Among the issues Homer and Hesiod raised are the nature of the best kind of life for a man and for a woman, the relation between humans and gods, what actions are virtuous, and whether and why a person should be virtuous, the relation between the individual and society, and the best kind of ruler. This list could be far longer. In the Archaic period, roughly 750 to 480, poets such as Tyrtaeus, Solon, Theognis, and Pindar enshrined traditional Greek ethical thought and raised questions and offered solutions of increasing sophistication. This moral tradition was continued in the 5th century by such authors as the historians Herodotus and Thucydides, and especially by the tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, whose treatments of moral issues are among the most sensitive and profound of any conceived in ancient Greece. Nevertheless, this work was something different from moral philosophy. The first people who can properly be said to have done work in moral philosophy were the 5th century sophists. These thinkers engaged in seminal discussions in the areas of moral, political, and social philosophy, and raised a host of issues in other philosophical areas as well, such as philosophy of language and epistemology. Some also engaged in scientific speculations familiar from the presocratic tradition, and one pursued themes associated with the Eleatics. The chief sophists overlapped in time, in their travels, and in their interests, so as a result it is hard to identify clear cases where one sophist is reacting to another. We get a picture of mutual influence, colored by professional rivalry. It is equally hard to identify a set of doctrines held by all of the sophists. Instead of a school of thought, they constituted a more broadly defined movement, whose common points include goals and methods as well as subject matter. So that's just a kind of a rough rundown. He's talking about questions about morals and ethics, and that stuff comes up in the presocratics, but he says it also comes up years before that, hundreds of years before that, in Homer and Hesiod, and questions of how people should behave, morals and ethics, comes up in poets such as Pindar, and also historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, tragedians. So these are the writers of Greek tragedy, including Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So these sorts of questions had come up, but it hadn't been really moral philosophy. It came in the form of poetry or history, but not just straight-up discussions about morals, which didn't really come about until the sophists. And the sophists talked about a whole wide range of things, and that he says basically it's not really a school because it's hard to pinpoint like one common belief among the sophists, that it's more of a movement defined by what they're doing and how they're doing it, as opposed to like a doctrine, the doctrine of the sophists, or anything like that. And in this next section, shortly after that, when he's talking about early Greek moral thought, he brings up a couple of points, a couple of concepts. And I know I've talked about arete or arete before. I guess the correct pronunciation is arete. My inclination is to say arete. But let's go with arete. I'll try and pronounce it correctly. And agathos. I don't think I've talked about agathos or agathon or agathos before. But those are important concepts. And so I'll read the section that he talks about arete and agathos, where he says, quote, "These two basic concepts of Greek morality are closely related and not straightforwardly translatable into English. As an approximation, arete can be rendered excellence or goodness, sometimes virtue, and agathos as excellent or good. The terms are related in that a thing or person is agathos if and only if it has arete, and just because it has arete. The concepts apply to objects, conditions, and actions, as well as to humans. They are connected with the concept of ergon, plural erga, which may be rendered as function or characteristic activity. A good or agathos person is one who performs human erga well. And similarly, a good knife is a knife that performs the ergon of a knife well. The ergon of a knife is cutting, and an agathos knife is one that cuts well. Thus, the arete of a knife is the qualities or characteristics a knife must have in order to cut well. Likewise, if a human ergon can be identified, an agathos human is one who can, and on appropriate occasions does, perform that ergon well. And human arete is the qualities or characteristics that enable him to do so. The classical discussion of these concepts occurs after our period in Aristotle, but he is only making explicit ideas that go back to Homer, and which throw light on much of the pre-philosophical ethical thought of the Greeks. This connection of concepts makes it automatic, virtually an analytic truth, that the right goal for a person, any person, is to be or become agathos, even if that goal is unreachable for someone. The arete agathos standard still stands as an ideal against which to measure one's successes and failures. However, there is room for debate over the nature of human erga, both whether there is a set of erga applicable to all humans and relevant to arete, and, supposing that there is such a set of erga, what those erga are. The existence of the arete agathos standard makes it vitally important to settle these issues, for otherwise human life is left adrift with no standards of conduct. End quote. So, arete and agathos. So he's basically saying that arete is like a noun. It means excellence, and it is a set of qualities that define someone as being excellent or good. And agathos is an adjective, so that an agathos person is a person who has arete, who has excellence. And then he brings up another term, erga or ergon. Erga is the plural, ergon is the singular. That's a function or a characteristic activity. So the erga or the ergon of a knife is cutting. In other words, the function of a knife is cutting. And an agathos knife is one that cuts well. And the arete of a knife, or the excellence of a knife, is the qualities or characteristics a knife must have in order to cut well. If you say, this knife has arete, this knife has excellence, this knife has the qualities that allow, what would make a knife excellent as opposed to not excellent? What is the arete of a knife? What is the excellence of a knife? What makes one knife agathos and another knife not agathos? One would have arete and the other one would not. But what is the arete of a knife? What is the excellence of a knife? How would you define it? Well, it would have to fulfill its function. If the function of the knife is to cut, the ergon of the knife is to cut, then the knife that is the arete of the knife. The excellence of the knife is the set of qualities of sharpness and durability and even perhaps beauty, of the correct size, of the correct weight and balance, the various qualities of the knife that allows it to perform its function correctly. So I think those are important and interesting terms and concepts. And it says something about what the Greeks valued, because agathos, or good, a good person, doesn't have to do necessarily with what we today would say makes a person good. We have different sorts of excellences. You usually would say, well, he's an excellent swimmer, or he's an excellent, this or that. But we don't always really pinpoint in our modern world the ergon or the function of a person to say that a person is good at just doing whatever it is people are supposed to do. When we say someone's a good person, we usually mean that they're a kind person, that they're a caring person. And so I think there's a sort of implicit notion that the function or the activity that a person would engage in correctly, in order for us to describe them as good, would be being charitable, being kind, this sort of demonstrating altruistic behavior, or demonstrating some sort of sympathy or concern for other people. There's an implicit notion about what the function is of a person, and that function is kindness, right? That's the quality that you're judged by when you say you're a good person. Now, that's only a certain part of it. I think, if you say, well, that's a good man, you're usually saying something a little bit more about them. When you specify like a gender like that, you say this is a good man, there's an implicit idea that not only is he like kind, but he also is manly, and he demonstrates the qualities that are the functions, the ergon of a man, that he has the sort of arity or the sort of excellence in performing manly functions that we would say he's good. But it's almost like back then there was a lot of discussion and question of, well, what is the purpose of a person? What is it about a person that would make him excellent? And this is something that, as I read there, that Aristotle takes up in his conversations about ethics. And everyone has a sort of different answer to this. And one thing that's important to point out is that the philosophers will often tell you that the ultimate function of a person is to engage in philosophy. But as I've stated in different episodes at different points, I think that if you were to talk to a soldier and ask what the arity of a soldier is, what the excellence of a soldier is, what are the qualities that someone would have for them to be agathos, it would have to do with fighting in war. And people who specialize in something, usually there's twofold, I suppose. They specialize in it because they think it's important, and they think it's important because they specialize in it. And it's hard to just take something that a person who contemplates for a living, and when they tell you that the greatest thing that you can do is engage in contemplation, you're foolish if you don't take that with a bit of a grain of salt. So, anyway, moving on from there to where he begins talking about Homer. In this section, he says, quote, "In the Iliad, the heroic ideal is well known and widely accepted as the standard by which a warrior is to be measured. It consists of several attributes, some of which we would consider external and some internal to the person. Some are thought to form part of a person's inherent nature, while others can be acquired. The ideal Homeric hero is male and well-born, the nobler the better. The best have a god or goddess as a parent or ancestor. He is a ruler and is wealthy, beautiful, excellent at fighting, excellent at counsel, excellent in leadership, brave, strong, generous to friends and harsh to enemies, reverent to the gods, and aware of his worth and of his position in society, and anxious to maintain and improve it. The expectation is that these qualities go together, and little attempt is made to analyze this ideal, to determine whether, say, anyone could be a hero without being beautiful. The circumstances in which this ideal is typically expressed are the activities of war. Fighting is normally hand-to-hand combat in which two warriors fight to the death. The competitive virtues are paramount, especially courage. On the other hand, within the army, the cooperative qualities of counsel and leadership have great importance. Counsel is given in circumstances where the leaders cooperate to decide on a course of action. And effective leadership requires behaving so as to merit the respect, loyalty, and obedience of those being led. Also, despite the unbridgeable gulf between mortal humans and immortal gods, humans can hope for a lesser kind of immortality by achieving fame, and so being remembered by others. This was achieved through epic poetry, which recorded the glorious deeds of men, and was memorized and performed for the entertainment and edification of future generations. Above all, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey served as a powerful and widely known source of ideals, which many of the philosophers saw as outdated and needing to be replaced. The Iliad, an epic of war, focuses on the warrior and ruling caste, which occupies the highest male positions in Homeric society. But to a small extent in the Iliad, and much more in the Odyssey, the poet shows us other aspects of the life of that semi-mythical world. There are virtues and appropriate modes of behavior, not only for warriors and rulers, but also for wives, children, parents, servants, bards, and the lesser nobles who are of local importance, but not to be ranked with the heroes of the Iliad. The cooperative and passive values of affection, hospitality, loyalty, patience, and endurance receive almost as much attention as the competitive and active virtues of courage, strength, and cleverness. The account just given picks out only a few features of the rich and varied world of the Homeric epics. The moral scene Homer presents is appropriate to the society it represents, and quite alien to our own. It is the starting point for subsequent moral speculation, which no one in the later Greek tradition could quite forget. Rapid change in Greek society in the archaic and classical periods called for new conceptions of the ideal human and the ideal human life and activities. The archaic period saw different kinds of rulers from the Homeric kings, and individual combat gave way to the united front of a phalanx of hoplites, or heavily armored warriors. Even though the Homeric warrior king was no longer a possible role in society, the qualities of good birth, beauty, courage, honor, and the abilities to give good counsel and rule well remained. Nevertheless, the various strands of the Homeric heroic ideal began to unravel. In particular, good birth, wealth, and fighting ability no longer automatically went together. This situation forced the issue. What are the best qualities we can possess? What constitutes human arity? The literary sources contain conflicting claims about the best life for a person, the best kind of person to be, and the relative merits of qualities thought to be ingredients of human happiness. In one way or another, these different conceptions of human excellence have Homeric origins, though they diverge from Homer's conception and from one another. End quote. Okay, so there's a section that I wanted to read about Homer. And what I want to point out, well, first of all, he talks about Homeric is talking about a sort of warrior ideal, and he describes a bunch of qualities that someone is expected to have, and it really runs the gamut. He says the ideal Homeric hero is male, well-born. He's a ruler, wealthy, beautiful, excellent at fighting, excellent at counsel, excellent in leadership, brave, strong, generous to friends, harsh to enemies, reverent to the gods, aware of his worth, of his position in society, anxious to maintain and improve it. So there's a whole host of qualities, and they are sort of assumed to go together. And over time, it began to be questioned, well, do all these qualities necessarily go together? And if they don't go together, then what is the most important thing? But what I think is important is he also talks about where he says, especially in the Odyssey, the poet shows us other aspects of the life of that semi-mythical world. He says there are virtues and appropriate modes of behavior, not only for warriors and rulers, but also for wives, children, parents, servants, bards, lesser nobles. So all these different types of people who have different roles in society to play all have a different, or at least partly different, set of qualities. That's not to say a completely different set of qualities. There's certainly overlap, but it's not exactly the same what the arete of a warrior and the arete of a wife are. They don't necessarily have the same, entirely same set of qualities. Or an old man. Does an old man necessarily have the same set of desired qualities? Wouldn't counsel become more important for an old man, and vitality and vigorous physical activity might not be as expected for an old man to do that sort of thing? Whereas a young man is expected to have the sort of reverse situation. It's probably not as expected or necessary for a person who's barely an adult to be giving wise counsel. Certainly it would be valued if a young person were able to give wise counsel, but I don't think it would be as expected. And so people in different social roles, people at different ages, and in different circumstances have different expectations, which kind of makes it more difficult and maybe even impossible to say what is human arete, what does human excellence consist of, what is the function of a human. It almost kind of seems like I sort of think it's a nonsensical question, and maybe it was understood in the Homeric era as sort of nonsensical as well, to say, well, what is the arete, what is the excellence, or what is the function of a person? What is the ergon of a person? What is the function of a person? How can you answer that? Depends who it is. The function of a ruler is to rule, and the function of a servant is to serve. And so people in different roles have different functions. And so because they have different functions, they have different types of excellence. But he does talk about how over time the ways of war changed, and those ideals of Homer over time became, apparently, according to the author, became outdated, or were considered outdated over time, and they began to be questioned. But they were always present. They were always a part of the discussion. And of course, one thing that I think it's important to do, and I find this very common, is that it's not necessarily the case that we can turn to Plato or Aristotle and gather from this philosopher or that philosopher or the school of philosophers, especially if you're isolating, you're looking at, Aristotle's a student of Plato who's a student of Socrates. So you've got this sort of line, even though they don't all agree on everything, you do have a group of philosophers who have some particular ideas. It's not the case that those ideas were the common, widely accepted Greek ideas, or otherwise Socrates would never have been put to death. There's a whole Greek society, even above and beyond just Athens, and they're going to have different ideals. And it's, I think, a mistake for us to look at Aristotle and look at the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, or what Plato has to say in the Republic, and say, well, here's how Greek thought changed from this point to that point. Well, that's only one person. That's only a couple of people who were teachers and students of one another. Other people thought differently. And there were certainly, in all likelihood, many people in the Greek world at the time of Plato and Aristotle who didn't think that Homer was really all that outdated. So I think it's important that we don't just assume that whatever Plato and Aristotle said is representative of Greek thought at large. So I want to move on into the discussion of Pindar, the poet. And this isn't a very long section, but I do want to talk about it. And I have Pindar, the Odes of Pindar. I have his his main book there. I'm probably not going to review it. I don't really review poetry books, but I do think Pindar is an important figure, so I felt like it was important for me to point out some of his contributions. So he says, quote, "In the late 6th and early 5th centuries, Pindar composed odes to celebrate victors in athletic competitions, including those held at the Olympic festival. His patrons, the victorious athletes, were wealthy, sometimes royal, and frequently aristocratic. Pindar champions an ideal that these people would tend to adopt for their own, so his poetry is a valuable source for the aristocratic mentality of his time, a set of traditions and attitudes with which the democratic tendencies of the 5th century had to cope, and which continued to exert pressure, if not always in an articulate voice, in the moral debates of the late 5th century. Pindar, unsurprisingly, gives prominence to the athletic ideal, with its emphasis on success. Victory at the games brings glory to a person for the rest of his life, also to his family, descendants, and city. Defeat is shameful, disgraceful, but the glory of victory, especially when spread abroad by the talents of a poet like Pindar, brings lasting fame and praise, two of the chief components of happiness, which is the supreme goal of life. Athletic competition was a form of divine worship, and took place in such sanctuaries as Olympia and Delphi as part of religious festivals. And Pindar insists that success in the games and in other fields is a mark of the gods' favor and cannot be gained without their assistance. However, it also requires valor, effort, daring, strength, and wealth, which are also gifts of the gods. The gods control all human things and can give and take away happiness at will. Since humans are frail and their destiny is shaky, it is important to be reverent to the gods, who alone can make prosperity long-lasting. Hence, in evaluating persons, actions, and qualities, it is important to judge by what happens in the end. Despite the uncertainty of the future, Pindar is sure of the consequences of success. Humans find good fortune hard to bear. It brings envy, slander, and mockery from others, and tends to make the fortunate person proud, overconfident, and arrogant. The jealousy of other humans can be dealt with, but arrogance or hubris brings divine retribution. The gods bring down the proud. Therefore, it is necessary to resist the impulses to go too far, to be moderate in good fortune, and to know your limits as a human being. Pindar was far from a moral philosopher. Instead of argument, he uses mythological archetypes to support the values he promotes and the advice he offers. No doubt his moral precepts do not form a tidy system, perhaps not even a consistent one. Sometimes they are banal to the point of vacuousness. Praise the good, he says with all seriousness. But overall, he recommends an aristocratic ideal of life appropriate for his time, a sophisticated, updated version of the Homeric ideal, in which noble birth, beauty, wealth, strength, daring, and success in competitive situations, athletics more than war, but Pindar often mentions military exploits, are prominent, as are excellence at council and government. Even such aesthetic qualities as appreciation for and support for music, festivals, and other lovely enterprises are quite at home in the Homeric ideal. What is new is the occurrence of such quiet, cooperative virtues as gentleness, righteousness, discretion, honesty, and modesty, as well as explicit advice to avoid excess and to be moderate. Nevertheless, in the world of Pindar's victorious aristocrats, as in Homer's elite warrior caste, the comfortable assumption is that all the desired qualities hang together reasonably coherently, and with the God's will can be attained in a lasting way. End quote. So what you see here is essentially the continuation of Homeric ideals in a slightly modified form, where he's not talking as much about war as he is about athletic competitions. But Pindar is writing poetry, but he's not writing in that same epic meter. Essentially, Pindar was hired by people who won these games to write poetry about the various successful athletes to help give them, lasting fame. And so Pindar would talk about the virtues of these successful athletes, and it's certainly embellished, but nonetheless, this is very traditional. It's very aristocratic, and although he modifies it and makes more of moderation, which was one of the important Greek ideals, as I've spoken of in other episodes, he does talk about a balance, not taking things to excess. Pindar talks about that, about not trying to emulate the gods, but being satisfied with worldly success. But it is a sort of aristocratic ideal, and Pindar is keeping those aristocratic ideals of strength, wealth, daring, beauty, those sorts of virtues, making sure that those stay in conversation. They remain over time the virtues that Greek aristocrats continue to strive for. So, yeah, I mean, he doesn't say an awful lot. I really read everything there that he said about Pindar, but I just think I think that it's unfortunate a little bit that the ideals of Pindar were not taken up more, perhaps enthusiastically, or given the weight in the minds of the philosophers. It seems like oftentimes the philosophers had started this project, which continues to this very day, of dismantling the traditional ideals, dismantling the traditional virtues, setting everything up to be re-examined perpetually, rather than those ideals that had brought the Greek states to the position that they were in the 5th century BC, setting them up to be successful. Their success in war that had allowed them to be prosperous and free of the influence and the control of the Persians, for example. All of the various ways of being that had brought Athens and the Greek world in general to its elevated position. Once that elevated position is acquired, philosophy begins to unfold and take it upon itself to try to sort of dismantle all of the virtues, or analyze and set everything up to be subject to a rational inquiry under philosophy. Philosophy has its ascetic quality, and this is really what Socrates was put to death for. The Greek polis is held together by a shared set of virtues, and rather than constantly subject everything to perpetual questions, the leaders of Athens felt that the virtues had proven their worth through the test of time and didn't need to be justified to Socrates. And I think that Pindar represents that tradition of simply accepting the virtues that had been passed down from their forefathers. So Pindar really is the major 5th century conservative poet, I think. and for that I'm appreciative. So I think when it comes to the sophists, I'm actually going to cut it off right there and not get into his discussion of the sophists. He doesn't talk at length about the sophists. I mean, I guess he does, but I'm not going to dig into this. He quotes from some of them at length, digging into Plato and elsewhere. And the fact of it is, I have another book on the sophists that goes into more detail. And this episode's getting on in the time, so I'm going to cut the section of sophists out, not discuss that. He does try to, he rehabilitates them a little bit, let's just say, and he points out how we can't just take Plato's word for it on what the sophists were all about. Plato sets the sophists up as the foil to Socrates, and they're in Plato's works for the express purpose of being defeated in argument by Socrates. So we can't take Plato's word for it exclusively on what exactly the sophists were about. And that's the main point that he makes in regard to them, and I think that's an important one. We can't just read Plato and think we understand the sophists from a hostile writer such as Plato. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that. I'll close this book out for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.